Hey everyone, welcome back. Thanks for joining us today. We have a brand new story to share, so let's dive in. My college, Temple University, had 20,000 women students, and Dean, my future wife, was one of the three most beautiful there. One afternoon, the three goddesses were seated together in the cafeteria, with every guy there lusting after them. I approached and asked if I could sketch them. One of the girls, Sally, and I were study buddies, but I didn't know the other two. "Don't you have anything better to do?" Deanna, a tall brunette, asked. I took her hand and replied, "No." "Well then," she added, "your sketch better be good." "Of course it will be," I said. "You three ladies inspire me." She was a 10, while the best-looking girl I'd ever dated was a 6+. Deanna clearly wasn't interested in me until Sally, one of the other stunning women, looked at the sketch and gave me a passionate kiss. Then she winked, and I got what she was doing. Deanna looked at the sketch and kissed me, glaring at Sally in triumph for having stolen my attention. "You're really talented," she said. Sally winked again and pointed at Deanna behind her back. She knew I was interested in Deanna and wanted to make her jealous. As Sally blew me a kiss and walked off, Deanna grabbed my hand. "If Sally's into you, you must be special. I don't have a boyfriend. Do you have a girlfriend?" I shook my head. "Well, you do now," she said, "and we've been together ever since." She was a bit quirky, possibly even weird, but I suppose that's why she was drawn to me. That sketch now hangs in our living room, alongside many others of my wife and children. I don't do freehand sketching anymore. I use a computer and am quite skilled with it. I often wondered what she saw in me, but soon it became clear. She was quite harsh to everyone who tried to talk to her. Many years later, I learned she was on the autism spectrum and had Asperger's syndrome. I was the only guy who could handle her occasional insults by turning them into jokes. I knew I wasn't her first choice. She insulted all the other guys who liked her and never understood why they left. We started dating at 18, married at 21, had our first child at 24, and moved to Los Angeles by 26. My wife could go days without saying more than, "Pass the salt." She realized that most of what she said came out as insults, so she limited her speech. While we were dating, I didn't fully grasp this, but after we married, I saw she also struggled with depression. She would have long crying spells, and I'd hold her, telling her the kids and I loved her, which sometimes helped. A smarter man might have left, but I loved her too much to abandon her or our children. Some kids might thrive after a divorce, but I've never met any of them. Did I mention she was not just the most beautiful woman I ever dated, but the most beautiful woman I ever knew? Some nights I stayed awake, thanking the universe as I gazed at my stunning wife. I suppose that makes me shallow, but so be it. I also learned that the harder she worked, the happier she felt. I was the complete opposite. We started a successful ad agency in our senior year. I handled the creative work while she managed everything else. We made a great team. Together, we bought a fixer-upper in a gentrifying neighborhood for very little, as it was still dangerous. We spent years remodeling it with every spare cent, building a media room and a weightlifting room where I worked out almost daily. I was in pretty good shape. I had to be if I wanted to keep my wife, as men were always hitting on her. We worked and lived together 24/7, through good times and bad, and I loved every minute of it. Dean struggled to make and keep friends, so I tried to fill that gap in her life. 25 years flew by in an instant, and then our third child was born. That's when everything started to change, and I never saw it coming. One day, she cried in my arms, lamenting that men no longer stared at her or flirted when she entered a room, something she desperately missed. Each day, as she looked in the mirror and noticed the lines on her face, she cried, despite my reassurances that she was still beautiful to me. I tried to remind her that she had avoided the heartbreak and complications of life by marrying young. But that all changed when she became friends with a woman named Carol, with whom we carpooled to our youngest son's elementary school. At first, I was thrilled that Dean finally had a friend. Carol was a real estate agent, and I knew her husband Barry was a lawyer. What I didn't realize was that he was a divorced lawyer who used his wife to network for business by breaking up the marriages of women she befriended. As a bonus, Carol would get the listing and commission on the divorce. My wife started repeating Carol's complaints, comparing me to the wealthy and successful Barry. She began criticizing me for working too many hours and earning too little. I was working extra hours to put our two older children through Ivy League colleges, and after paying their tuition, there was barely any money left. But our house had appreciated enormously and was now worth almost $2 million. Deanna constantly complained about how Carol's husband could buy her a Mercedes and how they had a vacation home in Carmel with frequent trips. It broke my heart to feel like such a disappointment to her. I had devoted the last 25 years to trying to make her happy, but clearly, she didn't care. Then, she and Carol started going out for girls' night every Saturday. After the first night, Deanna, my wife with Asperger's, who often didn't know when to hold back, confessed that Carol didn't understand why she settled for me when she could have done so much better, and still could. I wasn't foolish enough to complain or voice my distrust, so I borrowed a friend's car and followed them on their next outing. They went to a club and met up with an incredibly handsome younger friend of Carol's, who danced too closely with my wife all night. I wanted to confront them, to knock that guy out, but instead, I just took photos and waited by our car in the parking lot. When Deanna and Carol left without him, I felt a mix of heartbreak and furious anger. I drove my wife home and made a pot of tea for us. She told me about her evening, admitting she danced with several men, once each. I knew she was lying. Flirting with that other guy must have really excited her, because she made love to me nonstop for the rest of the night until I had to beg for mercy. The following week, she spent hours in the backyard talking on her cell phone in hushed tones. Based on our credit card statements, I noticed she was buying provocative clothes, which she hid from me. The following week, my wife couldn't go out for girls' night because her car wouldn't start. I had disconnected the battery, hoping this time out would cool her passion for that guy. I wanted to find a way to repair our relationship, so I suggested we take a film class at the local college, where we could watch unreleased films. She seemed to like the idea, but the next day she changed her mind. She told me that Carol said she shouldn't take a class with me, claiming it was just my attempt to manipulate her. What did that even mean? Undeterred, I bought tickets to the ballet for Saturday night. My wife loved ballet, but she refused, saying she was going out with Carol again. My marriage was in serious trouble. That week, my wife and Carol returned to the same bar, and my wife sat next to that same man. I positioned myself far away, but within sight, wearing a wig, hat, and sunglasses to conceal my identity. My wife, who normally didn't drink, was clearly making up for lost time. As she enjoyed her drinks, her companion had his hands close to her, and when he leaned in for a kiss, she didn't protest. I'd seen enough. I knew I had to put an end to this situation. I figured many of life's problems could be solved with a pitcher of beer. There were two guys at the next table who had run out of money but were still thirsty. I offered them $500 to buy 2 large pitchers of beer at the bar, with the condition that they would trip and spill one all over my wife. They accepted, and a few minutes later, my wife, in her brand new expensive clothes and shoes, was drenched with half a gallon of beer and smelled like a brewery. She cursed at the men and went to the ladies' room to try to dry off. She left the restaurant alone and returned to her car. I followed at a discreet distance. She couldn't keep the car in one lane. She had too much to drink. I called the police, warning them about a drunk driver, giving them her car make, license number, and direction of travel on Wilshire Boulevard. The police stopped my wife, smelled the beer on her, and arrested her for DUI. I let her spend the night in the drunk tank before bailing her out in the morning. I expressed my disappointment and told her I wouldn't bail her out again and that her girls' nights out were over. She insisted that Carol was right. I was too controlling and jealous of Carol, and I didn't want her to have any fun. I said, "Okay, then I won't bail you out. Call Carol to come get you." She begged and pleaded, finally crying and swearing she was done with girls' nights out, so I bailed her out of jail. Those nights out with Carol stopped, But Carol didn't stop meddling in my marriage. She invited us over for dinner, but had an ulterior motive. She and her husband suddenly started asking me questions about my income and our net worth. I realized I was being qualified for how much they could take from me in a divorce. They also had another reason for inviting us over. I'm skilled with computers since I work on graphic programs all day, and theirs was broken, so they asked me to take a look at it. I told them to go back to drinking in the den while I tried to fix the computer in the office. The first thing I did was shut it off and then turn it back on, which fixed the problem, as it almost always does. Being curious, I wanted to learn more about my adversaries, and it didn't take long to find the husband's QuickBooks and accounting files on the computer from the past 5 years. He earned over $500,000 a year, but when I looked at his TurboTax return, I saw he only reported $20,000 to the IRS. I printed up all this information and tucked it in my pocket. Underestimating me is never wise. If I'm after you, you'll never see it coming, and these two had it coming. That night, after we left, my wife mentioned that Carol had invited her to her vacation home 300 miles north of LA in Carmel for a week starting Labor Day Friday. I told her that was great. She needed some relaxation. The next day, I hired a private investigator to follow her on her trip, or perhaps her tryst. I bought a few dozen condoms and packed them in her luggage as a joke. At the PI's suggestion, I got a burner phone so our communications couldn't be easily discovered during a divorce. As my wife left our house carrying 2 heavy suitcases, she lost her balance, tripped, and hit her face on the steep steps, giving herself a black eye. The investigator followed her to Carol's vacation house, but soon called to tell me my wife didn't pick up Carol. She picked up a man instead. They didn't drive north to Carmel, but 100 miles south. I had sent the PI a photo of the man my wife had danced with, and it turned out to be the same man. They ended up in room 515 at a hotel in Laguna Beach. The investigator spoke to me in hushed tones because police officers were in the hotel restaurant nearby. On the spur of the moment, remembering my wife's black eye, I instructed him to tell those officers that a prostitute was being beaten in that room. I hoped the police could intervene before they had the chance to be intimate. 5 minutes later, the investigator informed me that my wife had been marched out of the room fully dressed and arrested for prostitution. Her boyfriend was arrested for assault and battery, and an hour later my wife called me, crying and asking me to bail her out of jail. She wouldn't tell me what the crime was, only where she was. I played dumb, asking why she wasn't in Carmel, but she refused to answer. Her bail was $5,000, and I told her I would drive down after I withdrew the money from our bank when it opened in the morning. But I didn't withdraw the money or drive down to bail her out. I wanted her to spend the entire 3-day Labor Day weekend in jail. One night last month hadn't taught her a lesson. I showed up at her arraignment and watched her plead guilty in shackles, wearing an orange jail uniform. In the past, I had seen my wife happy, sad, depressed, and confused. But this was the first time I saw her completely defeated and destroyed. She had hit rock bottom. Having so many condoms in her luggage was considered proof she was a prostitute, and she was sentenced to 6 months in jail, with the sentence suspended if she stayed out of trouble for 1 year. Surprise, surprise. She had a lawyer, Carol's husband, who also represented my wife's boyfriend, who seemed quite friendly with him. My investigator did some digging and found that the boyfriend had been named in 3 other divorce suits, all of which Carol's husband represented the wives in. I realized that Carol had set up my naive wife with a gigolo so she could get a 6% commission on our $2 million house, while her husband could make a few $100,000 representing my wife if I filed for divorce, which my wife begged me not to do. Half of the reason I didn't file was that I loved my children and my beautiful, depressed, neurotic, crazy wife. I had no desire to trade my beautiful house for a 1-bedroom walk-up in a bad neighborhood, and my wife finally understood that Carol's friendship was an act. Carol viewed her as just a weak-willed person to be taken advantage of. I explained to my wife that while some people might get away with cheating, karma always catches up with them. Next time, I wouldn't hesitate to let her rot in jail for 6 months. I also made it clear that if I ever thought she looked at another man, I would email her mugshots and conviction papers to everyone she had ever known. I would occasionally track her whereabouts, both on my own and with a private investigator. If she strayed, I would know, and her punishment would be swift and severe. When I asked if I had been that bad a husband, she said no. She had just become addicted to the validation and attention from a handsome young man who told her she was beautiful and desirable. She craved the excitement of clandestine meetings at the club and the planned getaway to Laguna Beach. I told her, "If you think spending time in jail is exciting, go right ahead and continue your behavior. I'm easygoing, but my last fight was in 9th grade. He was bigger than me, but I didn't back down, even though I knew he'd beat me. He did, and I walked away with a bloody nose. The only damage I inflicted on him was getting my blood all over his shirt. I'm not tough or belligerent unless you mess with me or my family. I may lose, but I won't back down." I took Barry's tax return and financial information to the nearest federal IRS office and California Franchise Tax Board office. They explained that if my information was accurate, I might be entitled to a reward. I wasn't done with him. Tax evasion is a crime of moral turpitude and grounds for a lawyer or real estate agent to lose their licenses. My final 2 stops of the day were the Real Estate Commission and the California Bar Association. Armed with Barry and Carol's financials and tax returns, the forensic accountants of the IRS discovered that Barry had also embezzled money from his clients. The state bar didn't care that he paid a gigolo to break up marriages. I explained that he was a lowlife who destroyed families, but they looked at me as if I were a dull-witted child to think they'd care. I called him a low-life piece of scum, which I realized was redundant. What else would you expect from a lawyer? As I stormed out, I felt satisfied. A few months later, I reveled in a newspaper story about Barry, a prominent local divorce attorney disbarred and indicted for tax evasion. Barry and Carol owed the IRS and Franchise Tax Board over $1 million, and the IRS confiscated over $400,000 in unreported cash from his home safe. Barry went to prison for 2 years, and his house and cars were seized to pay his back taxes. I bought his wife's Mercedes-Benz for a song at an IRS auction. I explained to my wife that living the high life like Barry and Carol is easy if you don't pay your taxes. Next to them, I knew I looked like a failure with much less money because I did pay my taxes. A year later, I received a $40,000 reward from the IRS and took my wife on a lavish vacation to Tahiti, where we worked on rebuilding our marriage. Carol is now an overweight cashier at our local supermarket. I always make sure to be in line at her register so I can smile and gloat. I also make sure she notices I own her former Mercedes-Benz convertible, which she has to walk past to get to her rusting 20-year-old Honda. She and her husband never figured out how the IRS got onto them. Karma is real, but sometimes it needs a little help from a wronged husband. That was 10 years ago. It took a year and that trip to Tahiti for our marriage to return to normal, but my wife learned her lesson. Like Johnny Cash, my wife now walks the line. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories like this. See you next time.